Everybody this morning, ready to dive into the third chapter of Lamentations? I hope so. Please rise. We're going to, I should do announcements first. Don't rise. Stay. Sit. Stay. Announcements are not that many this morning. The ones that I know of so far are that, number one, Rita has the directory, and this is an opportunity for you to update your information or fill out your information, or let us know, I'm throwing you a curveball, let us know if you need a physical copy of the directory. We are going to have digital copies of the directory, and at any time you can let us know that you would like to update the information that you have in the directory. That's fine. But around Lent every year, we are going to update the information in the directory so that we have the most up-to-date information. And what is that music? There we go. I was the one who started that music, so I'm like, what is that music? So we're going to update the directory around Lent every year. This is just an opportunity for us to be able to have information, because a lot of you will text me or email me and say, hey, do you have the contact for this person? Or, I want to get a meal to this person. Do you have that contact? This is just a way for us to have that information centrally located. And I don't always have your contacts unless you gave them to me. I don't always have your contact or the best number to reach you at. So definitely fill out the directory. If you're not in there yet, you put your information in so that you can be in the next directory. So that's number one announcement. Number two is what Kathy has.
Speaking of directory, I know Jerry and I said, it's so hard. Like, I don't know these people's names.
Sure.
So what I'm doing is asking each of them to take a photo.
Yes.
And we'll put the photo with the name.
I love it. A photo directory. Let's do it. Yay. Thank you. So find Kathy. She has the directory iPad that she can take a photo of. And then Rita, we'll go bowling and I'll match all the names to the pictures. You can just send me a photo too. Send us a photo if you'd like. So directory is happening. The goal always is to get that done by Easter. If it doesn't happen, that's okay. We'll be a couple weeks after that. But get your information in. Get a picture taken. If you don't want to use the picture, if you're not ready for that, just send me a picture. Otherwise, there's just going to be a question mark with like a blank face. Like, who is this person? No, we won't do that to you. The last thing that I know of, I can give you an update on the cafe. Really, really almost done this time. That's the horrible smell in the entryway, is that the cafe is, the kitchen, not the cafe, the kitchen is officially asbestos-free. So we are ready to move forward. Woohoo! We're ready to move forward with the process of now putting down new flooring. That flooring was selected by our crack team of flooring pickers. And that's going to be put down. That's going to be put down hopefully this week, Wednesday, Thursday, so that we can move everything back. And in anticipation of Fourth Friday, which I'm forgetting the date of right now, but it's the Fourth Friday, we will be having trivia back in the cafe. So please let your friends and family, especially those who like trivia, know, hey, we're doing this trivia thing. It's going to start a little bit earlier than we've been starting recently, but definitely 5:30, be here for trivia, because then I got to be back home after that. So that is all the announcements that I know of. Cafe, trivia, directory. If anybody else has anything else? No? Great. Please rise. We will do the call to worship together, and then we will sing a few songs. The call to worship this morning, again, not from Lamentations, but from one of the books of Lamentations, another book in the poetry genre of the Bible in the Old Testament. It comes from the book of Job. We gather as your people in this room and in lands far away to celebrate the world that you have created. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Let us view things in our life that have come to us from our labors and our work, saying, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Let us view the things in life which we have lost, dreams, loved ones, relationships, peace, and worldly possessions, saying, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Let us acknowledge the truth that there is so much that we are not responsible for. Our family of origin, our health, our privilege, the world that we came into, saying, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. For those things beyond our comprehension and our control, let us repeat again once more together. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Let's sing.
You see my poverty, and you are enough for me, Jesus. You gave the blind their sight, you raised the dead to life, and you've done the same for me, Jesus. Let's repeat that again. You know my every need. You see my poverty, and you are enough for me, Jesus. heart for our God. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my Lord there is taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, then this blessed assurance control that Christ has regarded my helpless estate and has shed his own blood for my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious love. My sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when the face shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the throne shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. 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 shades of gray. Though my questions, though my questions asked may never be resolved. Who have I but you? Who have I but you? Whom have I but you? Whom have I but you? You may be seated.
Before we jump into the text this morning, Lamentations 3, which is the longest, it's actually not, by words, it's not much longer than the other chapters, but it's the longest by verse. It's when the grief speeds up. And we'll get into all of that today. Before we jump into there, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come to you knowing that there isn't a right or wrong way to grieve or process loss, disappointment, lament, that there are ways that we can organize it that makes it more palatable. There are ways that we can acknowledge our own tendencies and the human tendencies within that grief to make it more manageable, but that there's no right or wrong way to go through it. Lord, remind us of the Apostle Paul in this series, even though we are not in the New Testament, that what we hear from the echoes forward in the gospel is that we lament not as those who have no hope. We grieve not as those who have no hope, but rather as those who know that all things one day will be set to rights. Give us that hopeful truth in the midst of difficulty for this congregation and in this world. Pray all these things in your name, and all God's people said together, Amen. So you know I am not that sick that I'm wearing a mask. Just whatever I have you don't want. It's just annoying. Makes it hard to sleep. It gives me a little bit of a weird voice. So we're going to start. We're just going to jump right into the text here. Do you mind throwing up a black background on that? Do you know how to do that? Oh, look at that. Look how fast they are. Carly was up at 7 a.m. in the freezing cold at a stable this morning, and yet she's here to not even run one computer, but two computers. It's pretty impressive. Pretty impressive. Pretty impressive. Where's Kate? Nobody knows. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. She also has to work, but her job doesn't let her be here sometimes. Okay. Coming from Lamentations 3, you are going to hear smack dab in the middle of this a little moment of hope. And I want you to process here with me for a moment. We have 22 verses in the first chapter, 22 verses in the second chapter, 22 verses in the fourth chapter, 22 verses in the fifth chapter, 66 verses in the third, in the middle. And so we have, even though this is not chiastic structure, I don't know how much I've gotten into chiasms with you guys yet. But the idea of a chiasm is that it's a poetic structure for telling stories that helps us remember, because all of this was oral tradition. Well, not Lamentations, but much of the Bible was oral before it was written down. And so understanding that much of the Bible was oral tradition before it was written down, they would create these kind of peaks and mountains where the first verse and the last verse were connected, and then you kind of go all the way back up into the middle. But this peak valley, or this peak down climactic middle thing, we see this in our modern literature and we see this in our modern novels. When you go to school, usually it's not quite like this. It's more like that in modern novels. You get to the climax of the book and then the book just ends, you know? But we see this kind of peak thing happen in most of our literature. This is a way that humans like to tell stories. Start off with the background, the context, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, the resolution. And so the book of Lamentations does this. And right smack dab in the middle of the middle, where, you know, because it's an acrostic, it's not chiastic, it's acrostic, but right smack dab in the middle of the middle, you will have the only verses of Lamentations that you will likely know. And when I start to read them, you will almost be able to repeat them back to me. Because unlike the rest of the book of Lamentations, which is skipped over in all of our lectionary, the little part in the middle of Lamentations is probably some of the most quoted Old Testament that you will hear. Most of the worship songs that we sing, many of the hymns that we sing, are lifted straight out of the middle of Lamentations. And so what's interesting is that you all get a window into the context before, during, and after these verses. And it actually gives you a much more holistic picture. You can understand why the hymnists who wrote, the poets who wrote our hymns and our greater worship songs that we sing would pick out this section, why it's so significant. Partially is not just because the words are important, but also because of where they fall in our context. And it will probably invoke an emotional response in you today, too. If you feel that little churning, the lump in your throat, it's because these are not only in most of our worship songs and in most of our hymns, they're also the words that are most commonly read at funerals. And I wanted to just acknowledge, I shouldn't have said that we're going to go to the text here, because I want to acknowledge this before we go here. The vulnerability that it takes to offer a prayers of the people like we had last week is something that is unique to very few faith communities these days. Most faith communities are about invoking an emotional response out of their people. Our faith community seems to be about bringing the emotions of life to this place and processing them together. This is super unique, and I just want to acknowledge the value and good in that. That this is what church, in my opinion, should be. Not in forcing you into an emotional by, you know, what we do back here with music and lighting, forcing you into an emotional relationship with God, but rather using what is in your life. And so I just wanted to acknowledge the vulnerability and thank the congregation, not only for those who shared, but also for those who were able to hold space and not break tension in that moment. And so that's why we're going deeper into it this week. There's stuff that I could talk about in this that's interesting to me academically, but I think that it's better to go deeper into where we were last week and actually process how the book of Lamentations in this. So without further ado, let's read the text. Like I said, it's not going to be quite as long as you might think, being 66 verses. All the verses are about half as long as the other verses in Lamentations. Starting in verse 1. And this poem is called, in my Bible, God's steadfast love endures. Because even in our Bibles, they have to title it. They can't deal with the complex nuance of Lamentations. Only 4 or 5 verses actually is that the message. But it's so transformative. Okay, let's go. This, by the way, is an acrostic as well. A through Z 3 times. I am one who has seen the affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven me and brought me into darkness without any light. Against me alone he turns his hand, again and again, all day long. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away, broken my bones, besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me sit in darkness, like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has put heavy chains upon me. Though I call and cry out for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked out my ways with hewn stones. He has made my paths crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He has led me away and tore me into pieces. He has made me desolate, bent his bow and set as a mark for his arrow. and set me as a mark for his arrow. He shot into my vitals the arrows of his quiver, and I have become the laughingstock of all my people. I object to their taunt songs all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has sated me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind against gravel. He has made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, gone is my glory, and all that I had hoped for in the Lord. The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, and therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the souls that seek him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for one to bear the yoke in youth and sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it, to put one's mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope, to give one's cheek to the smiter and be filled with insults. For the Lord will not reject forever. Although he causes grief, he will have compassion, according to the abundance of his steadfast love, for he does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone. With all the prisoners of the land who are crushed underfoot, when human rights are perverted and the presence of the Most High, when one case is subverted, does the Lord not see it? Who can command and have it done if the Lord has not ordained it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? Why should any who draw breath complain about punishment for their sins? Let us test and examine our ways. Return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts as well as our hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed, we have rebelled, and you have not forgotten. You have wrapped yourself in anger and pursued us, killing without pity. You have wrapped yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can pass through. You have made us filth and rubbish among our people. All our enemies have opened their mouths against us. Panic and pitfall have come upon us, devastation and destruction. My eyes flow with rivers of tears because of the destruction of my people. My eyes will flow without ceasing, without respite, until the Lord in heaven looks down and sees. My eyes cause me grief at the fate of all the young women in my city. Those who were my enemies, without cause, have hunted me like the bird. They've flung me alive into the pit. They've hurled stones upon me. Water closed in over my head, and I said, I am lost. I called upon your name, O Lord, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ear to my cry for help, but give me relief. You came near when I called upon you, and you said, do not fear. You have taken up my cause, O Lord, and redeemed my life. You have seen the wrong done to me, O Lord. Judge my cause. You have seen all their malice and all their plots against me. You have heard their taunts, O Lord, and all the plots against me. The whispers and murmurs of my assailants are against me all day long, whether I sit or rise. See, I am the object of their taunt songs. Pay them back for their deeds, according to the work of their hands. Give them anguish of heart. Your curse be upon them. Pursue them in anger and destroy them from under the Lord's heavens. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Today we're going to talk about Lamentations, the whole book of Lamentations, but specifically chapter 3, as the stages of grief. We're going to do a little bit of some test here today. I've learned from some educational books recently that the best way to teach someone is to test them. This is like when you think that you have to answer the right question, then you pay attention more. So here's the test. Stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, probably the most profound psychological framework for grief in the last 100 years. This psychologist, we had to learn about this in seminary, in chaplaincy. What are the 5 stages of grief? Just shout them out. Anger. I heard anger. Denial is one. Bargaining's one. Acceptance is one. Drinking, right letter, right idea, depression. Depression or despair. Despair, depression. So we have the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, despair, and acceptance. The problem with the stages of grief for most of us is that we think about these in a linear way. We, in Western culture, like process that ends in completion. This is why there is greater job satisfaction. It's been acknowledged. There's greater job satisfaction when you feel that what you've completed, what you've finished, at the end of a given period of time can be kind of checked off and removed. So this is my mom's dissertation partially was about this. This is why nurses can have it so rough, especially critical care nurses, because critical care nurses don't get to cross people off their list. It's just a compounding thing that happens every single time they go into work. There's just another problem, and you're not solving issues. Very, very rarely do you actually get to cross it off. This is why teachers oftentimes, if they were given the proper resources and things like that, that teaching as a profession has persisted as greater satisfaction internally, self-driven satisfaction. Most teachers will tell you, maybe I'm wrong about this, but most teachers that I know will tell you that they enjoy what they do. They find self-satisfaction in what they do. The reason most teachers, if they leave, it's because of other factors, external factors that make it really hard for them to do what they're supposed to do. But it's process. You watch a child go from not knowing to knowing, and then they go on to the next grade, and you move on. We like linear processes. We like having a task, finishing the task, looking at the task, and going, great, let's move on. The problem is, grief is never finished. I want you to hear that again. Grief is never finished. It is a process. And this is why, by the way, you should not have a goal regarding grief. You should have a purpose regarding your grief. The difference between goal and a purpose is that a goal can be accomplished, a purpose cannot. Most people think that they will have greater life satisfaction if they're able to achieve their goals. No. Actually, you're able to have greater life satisfaction if you have a purpose that you can continually work towards. Having something that you can achieve actually doesn't usually give you satisfaction, because you either achieve it and it feels great for a moment and then it goes away, or you achieve it and it does not fill the void in you that you wish it did. Purpose, not goals. But I digress. So when I looked up the stages of grief as Lamentations, I thought to myself, man, I've really figured out something. Nobody else has figured this out before, I learned in seminary, it's a really bad idea to preach a sermon of something that you came up with. Because if you came up with it, it's probably not true. There's been enough written about the Bible that at this point, if you're the one who's coming to some great revelation, it's probably heresy. But I was looking at this, so I Googled, stages of grief, Lamentations. And I got one, written by an American author group of scholars. And this is how it mapped out the Lamentation stages of grief. And I was like, oh man, this is really cool. The title of the article was, Is Lamentations an Early Example of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Stages of Grief? And one of the amazing things about the Bible that you will hear this is one of my main theological, or I guess biblical critical understandings of the Bible, is that the Bible at its best reveals things that we learn later from another method, science, psychology, etc. The Bible doesn't critique modern discovery. Oftentimes, the Bible already presents modern discovery ahead of time. This is why I do not see a conflict between the Bible and science. Most times, the Bible is actually speaking to something underneath the science that was already there. It's because the people in the Bible who wrote the Bible were very, very, very smart. Very smart. Especially this author who wrote Lamentations. And so, it's not surprising that the Lamentations does have these echoes of the stages of grief. But I don't like how they put it in this. So I'm going to read you what they said. They said, chapter 1, or actually it's like 1a going into 1b is starting anger, is denial. It says, our enemies betrayed us because they are evil. I'm summarizing greatly here. But it's a denial of why the destruction of Jerusalem happened. If you don't know what the destruction of Jerusalem is, go back, watch the first sermon again. Give you the context for this. But remember, these people, the book of Lamentations is written into the context of they have been taken over by the Babylonians and their whole city is destroyed and it's awful, horrible thing. But the first thing that they do is they deny that it is their responsibility that is the reason that this has come to pass. The first thing that they do is they go, God has simply not saved us. It's actually our enemies that are to blame. And so they go from denial to anger. And they direct their anger at two people, the author of Lamentations, two groups, I should say. The first person that they direct their anger towards is their enemies again. Okay, it was our enemy's fault. I'm denying why this happened. Now I'm going to try and make meaning out of this by calling the curse upon my enemies. God, lift up your hand against my enemies and just utterly destroy them, those who curse me. So that's anger against your enemy. But then they also, in chapter 2, get really mad at God. And last week, our whole message was about how that is okay. That God can take it, both week 1 and week 2. That God can handle your disorganized grief. That God is not threatened by your disorganized grief. That the only reason that you don't bring your disorganized grief to God is actually because you're worried that you can't bring it, not because if you really thought about it, God's handled it. God has been with people who went through things that you can't even imagine, and God's been all right. But that anger comes and is directed towards God. Why have you done this? This punishment is disproportionate. We don't like this. Sure, maybe we're responsible. The denial's going away. Maybe we're responsible, but this is a little harsh, God. This is a little extra. Come on. Wasn't that bad. All we did was kill our own children and sell them into prostitution. And then you have chapter 3, 2b into chapter 3a. And the author of this article says that 2b into 3a is bargaining. Trying to make a deal with God. If you will relent, then we will change. If you make us feel better, we'll feel better about this. We are at fault because we were wicked, and the wages of that wickedness are destruction. But if you turn this around for us, we will stop being that way. Right? And I want you to understand, bargaining to avoid punishment is not remorse. It's just self-serving. Bargaining is not a way that you deal with God that's going to help you, but it is natural and normal, and that's okay. It may be good for your processing in the time, but it's not remorse. They are still trying to say we won't do this thing again. Mostly this is chapter 2b. It's a little bit chapter 3. Mostly it's chapter 2b. They're saying we won't do this again if you bail us out. According to this author, this is 2b and 3a. And then we have 3b and 4, despair, depression, drinking. Oh God, we're utterly ruined. How will we ever go on? Woe is us. And then finally, acceptance in chapter 5. Our grief is so overwhelming that we must accept it or we will perish in it. Here's why I don't like this framework for understanding the stages of grief in the book of Lamentations. Because the most acceptance that we ever get is not in chapter 5. The most acceptance that we ever get is smack dab in the middle of chapter 3. The most bargaining that we ever get is actually more in chapter 2 and chapter 5. Not really in chapter 3. Anger, very clearly evident at the end of chapter 3, as much as it is in chapter 2 or chapter 1. Despair throughout. Every third verse, depression, despair. And so what does this actually teach us, the book of Lamentations? If we don't, this is what I would call eisegesis. I use that very carefully because the people who wrote this article are very, very brilliant, much smarter than I am. But I would argue that this is a little bit of eisegesis. Eisegesis is coming with a conclusion to the Bible and then fitting the Bible to your conclusion. Eisegesis is not always bad. Sometimes we have to reason, come to the Bible with a great example of this. Me and Phil used to talk about this all the time. Phil would talk about how, look, we can't escape the realities that we're seeing about geology and how old the earth is. This is inescapable. We have to bring that conclusion to the Bible and then negotiate with the text and how the Bible can still be true, that the earth is not only 6,000 years old. The earth is obviously not 6,000 years old. We can see that. It's so clearly evident at this point. Some eisegesis is necessary. This is what it is to be a Christian. By the way, the Bible is a great example of eisegesis. The Bible eisegetes itself. People later on take, after the Babylonian exile, and go back to the Old Testament and eisegete their understanding of their own wickedness back into the text. That's why we have parts of the Bible that are newer, that are buried inside of really old parts of the Bible. It's kind of weird. So eisegesis isn't always good, always terrible. I was always told in seminary, this is awful, 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 never, ever do it. It's unrealistic. We all have to eisegete. Even the Bible eisegetes itself. But I think this is a little bit going too far with eisegesis. We're really forcing it to fit our paradigm that the end of the fifth chapter of Lamentations is acceptance. It's not. What we're going to get to in 2 weeks is that the end of the fifth chapter of Lamentations is the most disorganized, jumpy, I've lost it, I can't handle this, I'm all done. Remember we said all of them are acrostics. It goes A through Z in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, 3 times in chapter 3, and chapter 4. It doesn't in chapter 5. The grief has become so disorganized that it's just all over the place. It's just a mess. That's not acceptance. Come on. That's not what acceptance looks like. And so this is the problem. We get acceptance here. The Little Book of Hope. I didn't do the whole Little Book of Hope. This is what we had to write about in seminary. But we have this very clear version of acceptance in the 5 verses that I've offered us. These are the ones that I said that you would know. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that one should quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. That's acceptance. That's what acceptance sounds like. Acceptance sounds like in the midst, yet still will I wait on the salvation of the Lord. Even though all of this mess, no caveats, the mercies are new every morning. This is my hope. Acceptance is hope in the midst of unhope, despair, loss, grief. But here's where I'm getting to with all this. I don't like chapter 1 is stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, stage 5. Because even after Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote these, she comes back later and says, I should have never called them stages because it was inferred by the people who were reading it that you would go linearly through it. Now, usually, I will say, denial is often the first stage. I think that's reasonable. And acceptance is ultimately the goal. But you don't go through them in a linear way. And those of you who have experienced profound grief, you know this to be true in your soul. And what I hope to do today is show you how Lamentations does not do that. How Lamentations is very jumpy with its grief stages. Because, and this is where we're landing, stages are not destinations. Stages are not destinations. The book of Lamentations very clearly shows us this. And now, modern psychology and grief counseling and chaplaincy have shown me this to be true as well. And the reason why this is so profoundly important, by the way, is because some of the most pain that we experienced in the midst of our grief, which is incredibly disorganizing, and we should organize it, and we'll get to all that, some of the most painful pieces are, why am I not over this yet? Is there something wrong with me? Why am I regressing? Why am I not through this? And this thing, this concept, I want you to understand. If you believe that the process of your grief is being done wrong, that there's something wrong with you, it will only get worse. There cannot be acceptance if you're not willing to own the pain. That's the truth. Because acceptance without acknowledgement of how hard it is just stage one, denial. Acceptance requires acknowledgement of the pain. And so actually what we get in the book of Lamentations, as I've already kind of alluded to, is this beautiful concept that it does not fit into our little boxes. Verse 1 of chapter 1 through verse 19 of chapter 1 are denial, and denial never comes back. No. There's denial and despair all over chapter 1, as well as anger. You can go verse by verse. What's the author trying to tell me in this one? What's their feelings in this one? Denial, anger, despair. Even in chapter 1, I think when I looked through, I tried to go through the whole book of Lamentations and look for all of them this week to find all of the instances of acceptance. This is obviously the clearest one in chapter 3. I think this is anybody who comes to the text without the eisegetical forethought that it has to finish in acceptance in chapter 5 is going to wind up landing on at least the most acceptance that happens in this whole book is in chapter 3. But there's even a verse in chapter 1, and I think one in chapter 2, although I might not be right about that. I don't remember. There's one in every one except for one. There's one of the 5 chapters that has no acceptance. I don't remember if it's 4 or 2. But even in chapter 1, there is acceptance for one verse. And so if you are a person who's experiencing profound grief right now, I want you to understand that your process is not going to be linear. In the same way that the process of the author of Lamentations was not linear. That grief is a process of taking something that's incredibly disorganized and does not make sense to your brain, which God gave you as an organizing organism. This is what your brain is. It's just trying to organize and make connections. And grief is it's so final. It's so painful. It doesn't organize well. This is a process. It's a process. And so some people who I know who have lost children, family, parents, spouses, will be more in acceptance on day 5 than they are on day 50 after that loss. That a little thing, that you can spend 2 weeks in acceptance 10 years after your loss. And you can feel really good about that acceptance and meaning making and bringing that to God and feeling good. And then you smell something and you're right back in denial or anger or bargaining. And none of these stages are bad. When we go back to them here for a second, I think we negatively connotate at least 4, right? Or at least 3 of the 4, but probably all 4. We go, if I'm in denial, I still have work to do. No, if you're in denial, that is God's defense mechanism for you in that moment. Do you understand that people who are in denial, if they tried to do acceptance when they were in denial and if they forced themselves into acceptance, their brain would just... God built denial into you to save you. God built bargaining in. You know what bargaining is? Bargaining is acknowledging that God still has power. You know what one of the most crushing things about grief is? Feeling powerless and feeling like your higher power has no power. Bargaining is a direct acknowledgement that that power could fix it. I remember bargaining right after my dad died an hour later. God, I'm going to be a pastor, God. Think of how amazing the testimony would be if you brought him back to life. Think about it, God. If I could tell people, I could go on tour telling people about how I prayed my dad back to life. It would be great. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. We'll get you some folks. I'll be like Billy Graham out here. Bargaining is acknowledging that your higher power still has power. It's not a bad stage. It's just a stage. Anger. If you're not angry about grief, then you're not mad enough about death yet. Do you understand that God got so mad about death that he killed it? That's the whole gospel that we're moving towards? People are very obsessed with the cross and what happened on the cross. I'm very much more interested in what happened in the tomb. Lots of people were crucified. Not many came back from the dead. God defeated death because death is something that you should be angry about. This is the whole point. If you're not mad about death, you're not thinking hard enough about it. In the same way, by the way, anger is our response to injustice. Death is an injustice on the way that God's created order. That's what death is. It's an injustice to our created order. If the people in my life who are not mad enough about racism and sexism and xenophobia and all of these other things are people who don't see those things as injustices. You should be mad. That's our God-given response to injustice. And if you're not mad about death, you don't see it as an injustice yet. Let's talk about it. It's unjust. Despair. If you don't experience despair in death, you didn't love that person. I had a really troubling conversation with a colleague in ministry recently about the death of their parents, which had not yet happened, and they said, I'm just not going to care when they die. It's not like they had no relationship. They didn't go no contact. They just said, yeah, I don't know. I'm just not really going to care. I said, man, that's a really good conversation to have with a therapist. Indifference is not good. I'd rather you hate somebody than be indifferent to them. If you're not experiencing despair as a response to your grief and trauma and loss, that should tell you something about the brokenness of your relationship with that person. Now, you can feel relief. You can feel acceptance one day and so, oh, John said that if I don't feel despair about this and the day he died yesterday, I should really be feeling despair by now, don't you think? If I really love them. No, you'll get there. Sometimes, as a caregiver, we have to experience relief first, acceptance first. But that's why I don't like this model of we're going right through. Sometimes it goes from denial to acceptance to despair to acceptance to bargaining, back to denial for 2 months, then to anger for a while, that you take out on the people who you're driving with and the people who get your order wrong at Starbucks, and then to despair, and then back to anger when your pet dies, and it brings up the same neural pathways that were just brought up in you when you lost your loved one, and then bargaining, and then, oh, that's despair again, because why am I lamenting over my pet? This is weird. And then you're back into denial. I wasn't really lamenting. And then you're into acceptance. Do you understand that this is how it works? And if we try and fix it into a timeline that works for our Western brains, you will always feel like you screwed up your own lament. But if you look at the Bible and the book of Lamentations, you see that the most acceptance that we get is right in the middle, and then we're still into hardcore anger, despair, bargaining in chapter 5. That is just a puddle. Brutal. That's why we're doing it during Holy Week, right? Brutal. So here's, I'm ending right now because we're out of time. Chapter 1. Talked about it 2 weeks ago. Takeaway. It's okay to bring your lament to God. Chapter 2, it's okay to organize your grief. In fact, you should. You need to organize your grief because if your grief is so disorganized, it's just going to compound the issue. Number 3, it's okay to cycle through the stages. It's okay to not be where you want to be. It's okay to feel pain. It's okay to bargain. It's okay to be in denial. None of these things make you a bad or unfaithful person. Acceptance is something that happens for 5 minutes sometimes. And hopefully over time you spend more and more time in acceptance and less time in the other four. But on the anniversary, you're probably not going to be in acceptance for the first decade or two. When you have that smell, when you hear their name, you're probably not going to be in acceptance for the first couple of years. And that's okay. That is the way that God made you. Do you understand? To deal with the injustice of death. So wherever you are, understand this, that God is with you in it. This is what we celebrate in the story of Christmas. That God joins us on earth in our grief. If you're bargaining, if you're angry, if you're depressed, if you're denying, or if you're accepting, God is there with you. We have examples of Jesus going through all 5 stages, by the way. And God is not only there with you, God is in it. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, as we acknowledge and accept that we are not always where we want to be or not always in a comfortable place with our grief and loss, we also want to bring to you and offer to you that all of our grief, wherever we are, has purpose. That if we go into grief goal-oriented to finish the process and end our grief and loss, that we will miss the purpose in our grief, which is to connect more deeply with ourselves, our neighbor, the world, and you. Lord, this is the good news of the gospel, that we don't grieve as those who have no hope, but not that we don't grieve. That we still go through the stages of grief, and that we don't have to fit them into our little Western paradigm of check, 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 all done. That we can go in and out of acceptance and despair and loss. And that even though that path feels crooked and narrow and dark and in the woods and not nearly as simple as a big gaping highway towards acceptance, what we might like, that even in that forest you are our way maker. Amen.
I invite you to stand if you'd like for this last song. You are here, moving in our midst, and I worship you, and I worship you. You are here, working in this place, and I worship you, and I worship you. 'Cause you are a way maker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are a way maker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are here, touching every heart, and I worship you, and I worship you. You are here, healing every heart, and I worship you, and I worship you. You are here turning lives. You are here turning lives around, and I worship you, and I worship you. You are here, in every heart, and I worship you, and I worship you. 'Cause you are a way maker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are a way maker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. That is who you are. That is who you are.
so as you continue to process the grief, maybe that you brought here, maybe that you didn't, know that there is no linear path towards acceptance, that acceptance is a state that you find yourself in one day for a few moments and then the next it's gone, and that's okay. That's still God making a way, even when you can't feel it, even when you don't know it. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Amen.